Welcome back to the Tom Brideson Show. Now, today I wanted to talk about why you should spend time building a base in your training rather than just focusing on the outcome. Now, I often talk to my team about this, and spending time building the qualities you want at an intensity that allows you to really focus on the technique that you want and the outcome that you want is just so beneficial to your training. Now, I kind of want to break out the different components and how you can get the most out of it, and then also a couple of things to avoid in terms of base building. Now, if you're thinking about base building, what it actually is spending time, say between 65 and 80% of your 1RM, simmering a ton of sets and reps, working at an intensity that's going to allow you to just solidify your training technique, solidify any changes in your technique that you're trying to make. Because once you get past sort of say that 85, 90%, you're going to revert back to your old training technique patterns. So what you want to do is spend some time building and simmering sets and reps between say that 65 and 80% range. Now, if you can do that for a considerable amount of time with some higher rep ranges, what that's going to allow you to do is transform your training technique and build up any weak points that you have and transfer them then into strength points. Now, when you spend time building a base, it projects you so far forward. It adds so much to your training total. It adds a lot of confidence to you in your lifting because you've just done so many sets and reps. So, I bang on about this all the time, but I really do believe that the outcomes that you get in training are made when you're building the base. Now, there's a few different ways that you can look at building a base. It doesn't mean that you need to throw yourself into, sets of 12s and 15s for your main lifts. What you can do is sit on the higher rep range. I typically don't like to go over 8 reps for big compound movements like squat, bench, and deadlift. I do go higher with bench press, but typically for like the main days, it's normally around 8 or below. And I would sit between say 4 and 8 reps in this base building phase. And what you want to be doing is actually just getting a lot of density in your training. So you can use a system where you're increasing sets as the training phases go on. So towards the end of the base build, say it's 3 phases, say you started a training block and the end of that training block, you finish on 4 sets. Say your third block, you might be finishing on 6 sets. So you can see there that you've actually built density into your training. You've built volume into your training without actually adding a crazy amount of actual training intensity in terms of the actual load that's going on the bar. So the benefit of this is just the continual sets and reps and the momentum that you're building in your training is going to pay dividends to when you then transfer that into more of a dense training program for strength. Now, when you are looking at it as well, you can really tie your nutrition into these base building phases. Now, say for instance, let's just talk about powerlifting and strength training for a little bit here. But say for instance, you've just come off a training block and you've had a comp and you've just been in a deficit for a very long period of time getting into that comp. What you want to do in these base building phases is add some food back into the scene. So basically you could bring yourself into a maintenance period where you restore how you're functioning. You can build up a little bit more muscle mass and you can get back to like equilibrium. You can get back to a base point. Then from there, you have the option to either, if you need to go back down into a deficit, you can, or you can continue your journey up into putting on some muscle mass and into a little bit of a surplus. Now, the opposite is true as well. So say you've just come off, a competition and you really ate up into that actual prep. What you could then do is move into the base building period in a slight deficit, which then, because you've got a lot of output in your actual training, because you're just doing a lot of sets and reps, it's actually sort of going to coincide really well with actually going into a deficit. Because your output's so high, it's very easy to push yourself into a deficit as well. So you can tie your nutrition actually into these base building as well. But the ethos of it, that you really want to be spending some time building just some quality foundations of training technique. That is the thing that's really going to project you forward with your training. Now, when we look at strength training blocks, for instance, you get to a certain point in your training where you can very easily divert back to your old training technique. And if you haven't spent enough time really just like dialing in on the foundation, dialing in on your cue points and your technique points, quite often what happens is, say, once you get past 90%, is you just revert back to your, like, the path of least resistance, which is your old training technique. So these base building phases are just so important for ingraining the patterns and the movements that you really want to see a little bit later on down. Now, from another standpoint is you can't have your foot pushed right down to the floor the entire year with training. If you're constantly just pushing hard in terms of intensity, you're going to get to a point where it's going to burn you out. You're probably going to get, you're probably going to see like quite a few little niggles pop up here and there because you're constantly on the threshold. But just from a motivation standpoint and an enjoyment standpoint, you're probably going to get into the gym being like, I've got to step up again. I've got another really heavy session that I need to step up for. And that can actually become, quite draining mentally. So it's actually nice to have these periods where you pull back because it refreshes things up a little bit as well. It gives you an opportunity to miss lifting heavier weights. As much as we like lifting heavier weights, we like getting stronger, you can't do it year round. You're going to get to a point where you're going to want a little bit of a break. Now, if we look at it from a physiology standpoint as well, when we're pushing into these really heavy phases of training, it puts a lot more stress on our joints. It puts a lot more stress on our actual tendons itself. So pulling the intensity back in these base building phases allows you to put a bit more focus back now into the actual muscle mass itself. So you can get a little bit more of that mind-muscle connection. You can get a little bit more like contraction, like active contraction through the actual muscle groups that you're targeting. Because sometimes, when you're training and you're going through a heavy lift, it's just fight or flight mode. Like you're bracing in and you're trusting that you've done enough work to get through the lift. And even though it's conscious in terms of cueing, you might not necessarily be consciously thinking about the actual muscle mass and the muscle tissue that's involved in that movement itself. So pulling back into these base building phases are just so important for so many different reasons. You've got the mindset side of things, your enjoyment of training. You've got, from a physiology standpoint, you've got giving certain body parts just an opportunity to recover after pushing really hard. You can tie in body composition changes post having either a dieting or a surplus phase. And then you've just got enjoyment of training and having that variety of stimulus, which is really important in training, enjoying different phases of training programs because you don't want to do the same thing year round. Now, I'm going to talk about powerlifting specifically here. So say you've come off a very heavy training phase and you've pushed the intensity up really, really high. Coming off the back of that, it's been like, it's quite an intense block. So coming off the back of that, you'll probably want to spend a little bit of time going through like a bit of a variability program where it's not too specific. It's not thinking about base building. It's just taking a step back, dropping off a little bit of volume, adding in some movement patterns that you haven't done for a bit of time before jumping into a base. Because what ends up happening then is you go from one hard directly into another hard. So you want to have a little bit of a period where mentally you just have a break in between and your body can just chill out. So you don't want to jump just straight from a really high intensity block into a really high intensity base building. What you want to do is sort of transition into that. But when you get to that base building phase, it's really important to know that you're going to be working really hard during that, because I honestly believe that's where most of your success in training later on is made. It's in that first phase of your base building where you're really setting the foundations to move forward. Now, what you don't want to be doing in a base building phase is just absolutely sitting on the threshold. Now, say for instance, you're doing sets of 8 and I'm doing 3 sets of 8, 4 sets of 8, 5 sets of 8, 6 sets of 8 over a 4-week phase. Not that I would necessarily program like that, but just as an example to make it look easy. If you were doing it like that, you don't want to be sitting at an 8 RM intensity for those 4 weeks. You want to build up progressively. So by the time you get to the back end of that training phase, it's the hardest. So the first 2 weeks of that program, for instance, might actually be, relatively comfortable. It's never going to be easy, but relatively comfortable, but constructive. You're working on your techniques, you're working on the patterns that you're looking to improve. And then as you progress through that training phase, it gets progressively harder and harder and harder. Now, if you cook yourself too soon in that training phase, you're going to have nowhere to go. You're going to hit your ceiling very soon on. So you don't want to sit on the threshold from week 1. You really want to ease yourself into it and allow the density of the sets and reps and the fatigue of each training block to catch up towards the end of the training program. You don't want to hit it at the start. So that's a really easy way to make sure that you don't get what you need out of the base. And say, for instance, you've come out of a really heavy block, you've had a little variability block, and then you've moved into a base building program. You're still not used to actually hitting sets and reps like that at high volume. So you actually need to ease yourself into it a little bit as well. You don't want to go too hard out of the gates, because what will end up happening there is you might then end up with some sort of overuse injury. So even though you are dropping the intensity back, you still need to respect the fact that you're changing the training stimulus. So you need to ease yourself into that before you then add the density to it. So say, for instance, you spent 3 training phases in this base building block. That first base building block is like an intro block. So the volume's not going to be crazy high, but it's starting to acclimatize you to the stresses that you're going to need in the next 2 phases. Then what you'll look to do over those next 2 phases is add density through adding training volume. So higher repetitions, more amount of sets. And yes, naturally, the intensity will go up, but it's not going up to a point where it's going to push you way past your threshold of what you can recover from. Now, when you've been working with someone long enough and you have 1 RMs, for instance, you can work back from that point. And it's very easy to keep someone within a window. So you can give ranges for them to work within, and if they're working with that range, say between 65% and 85%, that they're going to be really just building the qualities that you want, and they're not going to be pushing too far past that threshold. There's a whole nother discussion where people are preferencing like lower volume, lower set work, lower set training workouts, because it's like doing the minimal amount of work to get the maximal amount of results. Now, what I would say to that is if you can keep someone within a certain range and within a certain window, that isn't even really a discussion point, because that they're going to be working within a range that's going to be really constructive towards their training. So if you're working within that 65% to 85%, and you're doing a ton of sets and reps within that, it's really not pushing you way past your threshold. It's just sitting in that mid-range, and then you can just simmer that and get the qualities that you want out of it. Where I think if you pull the volume way too far backwards, the issue becomes that you don't get the stimulus where you're then being conducive to building muscle mass. And, these base building phases are just such a good opportunity for you to be adding muscle mass, adding really great training technique, and building a platform for you to use later on. Now, you can also use this not just from a strength standpoint. If you're looking at We'll start with strength training, but if you're looking at strength training in general, and if that is your main focus, the first part of your training year would actually be more of a base build, where you're just sort of doing more conditioning, higher rep work, more hypertrophy work, and then you would taper down into more dense training with higher intensity and loads. Now, if you were more focused on composition and building muscle mass, for instance, you can actually go the other way. So you can start your training year building some density through your training, through strength training, and then tapering up as you go. So what I would actually say to that is spend some time doing base building at the start, then jump into some strength training. So you might spend 2 or 3 blocks doing strength training, and then you would push out into hypertrophy. Now, how that would look is you would do your denser training at the start, and then you would add a ton of volume to the back end and really pushing the hypertrophy adaptations towards the back end of your training program. So base building isn't just specific for strength training. It's really specific for powerlifting as well, because it builds like a baseline level and a base foundation for you to use later on. And it's really specific to strength and hypertrophy. It just depends the way that you structure your program. So, just to recap on that one, if you are looking at focusing more so on strength training, start your year with more higher reps, conditioning, base building, and then taper down. But then if you're looking at more hypertrophy, for instance, you can start your year with strength training and taper up the other way. Now, I think with base building as well, you've got to go into it with a mindset of not just getting it done, of actually being really present when you're doing it. Quite often I see, when people get thrown into say, 6, 8 or 10 reps, is just sort of moving through the motions with no conscious efforts around how they're creating tension, how they're stabilizing the system. And it's just like, let's just get it done. If you have that style approach with your base building, you're probably not going to get the technical changes that you want from your training. You might get the muscle mass adaptations, but you're probably not going to get the technical changes. So as you transition back into like higher intensity strength work, you're probably going to find that not a lot has changed. So the hardest thing is because it is quite hard holding your position, holding your technique for say a set of 8. But if you can do that in your training, in this base building phase, your mental attention as you transition into strength, it's going to be so much easier because you've just held technique really well for a set of 8. Now you're moving into 5s, 4s, 3s. Mentally, that's quite easy, but you don't want to miss the whole technical improvement from the base building phase. So don't just rinse through the sets and reps, really be present in them, spend some time, focus as hard as you can, because the better and the more present you can be there, the more you're going to get out of it long term. Now, I truly believe this, and I honestly believe that if you spend a lot of conscious effort and you spend a lot of time at these base building, it's going to spend more time at the end of your training programs in a really successful state. One of the issues that I find with powerlifting and, powerlifting schedule as a whole is quite often the comps are stacked back to back. And the issue is people don't actually spend time base building. They just spend time jumping from comp to comp. So they're constantly pushing their nervous system. They're constantly, jumping under heavy loads, and they don't have that opportunity to actually then build the attributes that they want. So quite often I actually suggest to my guys, if they really want to get stronger, take a year off and spend some time building all the base foundations that they want and then express them later in a peak. Because instead of chasing, 10 kilos on your total, you can chase 50 kilos on your total. And if you're looking at it from a muscle mass standpoint, you can add a ton of muscle mass in a time where you allow yourself enough time to actually grow. Because, if you look at any training program, we've got to move away from looking at like a training phase, and we've got to start to look at the bigger picture, and we start to look at years at a time. And then you divide that year into chunks of time. So you might spend, 4 months doing one thing, 4 months doing another thing, and then 4 months doing another thing. And when you break it up like that, it's a very clear pathway to making progress. Because if you spend 4 months working on your strength, you're going to make progress in strength. If you spend 4 months building a base, you're going to make a fantastic base. If you spend 4 months building and working on hypertrophy, you're going to make a ton of progress building muscle mass. So you've got to be really specific with the adaptations that you're chasing. And I truly believe it starts with the base building. So I think just to recap things a little bit is To get the most out of your actual base building, take your time easing into it. Allow yourself enough time that you can make technical changes and make some progress in your actual training itself. Like one training phase probably isn't enough. You want to spend some time and you want to have no pressure or time outcome. You want to spend some time there building the base, building some quality sets and reps, and then pairing in your nutrition into that, whether that's going into a surplus, whether that's coming back to maintenance calories, or whether that's going into a deficit, because it's a perfect opportunity to make body composition changes whilst you're making all these technical changes in your actual training itself. Then use that base that you've built to transition into something else, whether that's strength or hypertrophy, because that's going to be the thing. It's going to be the foundation that you're going to use in your training moving forward. Now, watch out that you don't go too hard too soon in these base building phases, because what will end up happening is you'll hit your threshold way too soon and you will burn out. So that's it for me today. Hopefully you enjoyed the episode, and I'll see you guys next time.